Title: I live in a high-rise and someone has been knocking from inside my bedroom walls. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. Most people think walls are solid, safe, silent. But in high-rise buildings, there are spaces no one thinks about. Hollow gaps between apartments, hidden shafts, places where sound travels, and sometimes something else does too. He thought the knocking in his bedroom wall was just plumbing, until it started answering him. And whatever was inside those walls knew exactly where he slept. The building stood 43 floors high, a concrete structure pressed tightly between others just like it, forming a skyline of identical towers that looked almost indistinguishable from a distance. At night, hundreds of windows lit up in uneven patterns, giving the impression of life stacked in layers. From the outside it felt ordinary. From the inside it felt crowded. The man had moved into apartment 27B 3 months earlier. It was a one-bedroom unit on a higher floor, far enough from the street to avoid noise but not high enough to feel isolated. The space was small but clean, with narrow hallways and thin walls that carried the faint sounds of other people's lives. Elevators moving, doors closing, water running through pipes. Nothing unusual. The first time he noticed the knocking, it was just after midnight. A soft, hollow sound came from the wall beside his bed. 3 slow taps, evenly spaced, followed by silence. It was quiet enough that he almost ignored it. Buildings made noise all the time. Pipes expanded. Air shifted through vents. The structure settled in ways that created small, harmless sounds. He turned over and went back to sleep. The next night it happened again. 3 knocks. Same place. Same rhythm. He sat up this time, listening more carefully. The wall was still. No movement. No vibration. Just silence stretching longer than it should have. He pressed his hand against the surface. Cold. Solid. Nothing on the other side that he could feel. He convinced himself it was plumbing again. Something inside the walls reacting to pressure changes. The kind of thing people in older buildings learn to ignore. But the pattern continued. Every night. Always after midnight. Always 3 knocks. Over the next few days, the timing became more precise. The sound came at exactly the same minute each night, as if something inside the wall followed a schedule. He began to stay awake waiting for it. When the knocking came, it felt less like random noise and more like intention. Measured. Controlled. Deliberate. He started paying closer attention to the wall itself. The knocking came from the same spot every time, about 2 feet above the mattress and slightly to the left of where his head rested when he slept. He checked the other side of the wall. The apartment layout suggested another bedroom directly adjacent to his, but when he knocked on his neighbor's door the next day, no one answered. The hallway outside felt unusually quiet. Later that evening, he asked the building manager about the neighboring unit. The response was brief. That apartment had been empty for months. No one lived there. No one had access to it except maintenance. The explanation should have ended the concern. Instead, it made the knocking harder to ignore. That night, he stayed awake again. The room was completely dark except for faint city lights slipping through the blinds. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if the space itself was waiting. Then it came. 3 knocks. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he listened. The sound had changed slightly. It was no longer hollow. It was closer. More direct. As if whatever was making it had shifted nearer to the surface of the wall. He sat up slowly and placed his hand against the exact spot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something tapped back. Not 3 times. Just once. A single, firm knock directly against the place where his hand rested. He pulled his hand away instantly. The air in the room felt colder, though nothing had changed physically. He stared at the wall for several seconds, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The idea formed slowly. Something inside the wall had responded. The thought felt irrational, but there was no other explanation that matched what he had experienced. The next night he decided to test it. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited. When the knocking came, he leaned forward and tapped lightly on the wall in the same rhythm. 3 knocks. He waited. At first, nothing happened. Then, after a pause that felt too long to be coincidence, the wall answered. 3 knocks. Perfectly matched. The same spacing. The same force. He tried again. This time he knocked twice. The response came almost immediately. 2 knocks. His chest tightened. The pattern continued. Every time he tapped, the wall answered. Not randomly. Not imperfectly. Exactly. As if something on the other side was listening. Learning. Responding. The space between each exchange grew shorter as the nights went on. What began as delayed responses turned into immediate replies, as though whatever was inside the wall had become accustomed to the interaction. The knocking became a form of communication. Simple at first, then more frequent, more eager. He began to notice other changes. The wall felt different when he touched it, softer in certain areas. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that he hesitated before pressing his hand against it again. At times, it almost felt like there was a slight give beneath the surface, as if the material behind the paint was no longer entirely solid. The sounds also began to vary. It wasn't always just knocking anymore. Sometimes there were faint scraping noises, like something moving slowly within a narrow space. Other times, a dragging sound traveled vertically through the wall, starting near the floor and ending just above where the knocking usually occurred. It felt like something was repositioning itself, adapting. One night, the pattern broke. The knocking didn't come at midnight. It came earlier, much earlier. He was still awake, sitting at his desk across the room, when the first tap echoed from the wall. He turned slowly. The sound came again, this time louder, more urgent. He stood up and walked toward the wall, his movements cautious as a sense of unease settled deeper into his chest. The knocking started again. Not 3 times. Not in any recognizable pattern. Just repeated strikes against the inside of the wall. Fast, uneven, desperate. He stepped back instinctively. The surface of the wall shifted slightly under the pressure from within. It wasn't visible in a dramatic way, but the flatness was gone. There was movement now, subtle but undeniable, as if something was pressing outward from the other side. He stared at the spot where the knocking had always come from. The paint looked slightly darker there, uneven, almost damp. The realization came without warning. Whatever had been knocking was no longer just tapping. It was trying to get through. He backed away further, his breathing shallow as the wall continued to react. The knocking slowed, then stopped. The room fell silent again. But the silence felt different. Not empty. Occupied. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the far corner of the room, watching the wall as if expecting it to change again. Hours passed. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. The wall remained still. But just before morning, as the first light began to filter through the blinds, he noticed something that made the unease return instantly. The area where the knocking had come from was no longer smooth. There were faint indentations in the surface. Long, thin, parallel. Like something had been pressing from the inside repeatedly. Not knocking anymore. Feeling. Testing. And whatever was inside the wall had stopped waiting for midnight. It had started moving on its own time. Closer. And closer to where he slept. Morning light did little to make the room feel normal again. The man remained in the same corner where he had spent the night, his eyes fixed on the wall beside his bed. In daylight, the apartment looked ordinary again. The shadows had retreated, and the details of the room returned to their familiar shapes. But the wall had changed. The surface where the knocking had come from was no longer flat. The paint showed faint warping, subtle distortions that hadn't been there before. The indentations he had noticed earlier were clearer now, thin, uneven lines pressed outward from within, as if something had been testing the barrier repeatedly over time. He approached slowly. Each step felt deliberate, cautious, like he was entering a space that no longer belonged entirely to him. When he reached the wall, he hesitated before touching it. Then he pressed his fingers gently against the surface. The wall felt warmer than it should have. Not hot. Not even noticeably unnatural at first. But warmer than the rest of the room. He pulled his hand away immediately. Something about that small difference unsettled him more than the knocking ever had. It suggested presence, movement, life. He stepped back and looked around the room, suddenly aware of how enclosed the space felt. The bedroom had always been small, but now it felt compressed, like the walls were closer than they had been before. The thought formed quietly. If something was inside the wall, it wasn't just behind one surface. It could be moving through the entire structure. He left the apartment later that morning and went directly to the building management office. The conversation was brief. Maintenance records showed nothing unusual. No reports of structural damage. No ongoing repairs in the surrounding units. The neighboring apartment was still listed as vacant. No one had entered it in months. He insisted on seeing it. After some reluctance, the building manager allowed access. The door to the neighboring unit opened into a space that felt colder than his own. The air inside was stale, untouched, and heavier than expected. The layout mirrored his apartment exactly. Same bedroom placement. Same shared wall. He walked directly to the adjacent room. The wall opposite his bed stood silent. unmarked, completely smooth. No indentations, no signs of damage, no explanation. He pressed his hand against it. Cold, solid, lifeless. Whatever had been pressing from the other side of his wall had left no trace here. The realization settled slowly. The thing inside the wall wasn't confined to one apartment. It wasn't fixed in one place. It was moving through the space between them. That night, he did not return to his bedroom immediately. He stayed in the living area, keeping the lights on longer than usual, trying to convince himself that distance would make a difference. But the apartment felt different now. Not just the bedroom. The entire space felt connected in a way he couldn't ignore. Eventually, exhaustion forced him back. He entered the bedroom cautiously, his eyes moving immediately to the wall. It looked unchanged. Still, quiet. He waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing happened. The silence stretched longer than it had in days. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it might be over. Then the knocking started again. Not from the usual place. From the ceiling. A single knock echoed from directly above him. He froze. Another knock followed. Then another. Each one spaced evenly, deliberate, controlled. He slowly looked upward. The ceiling showed no visible movement. But the sound was clear. Something had moved. It was no longer inside the wall beside his bed. It was above him. He stepped backward, away from the center of the room. The knocking followed. 1, 2, 3. The pattern shifted slightly as it moved across the ceiling, tracing a slow path toward the corner above his bed. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Then came a new sound. A faint dragging noise. It moved downward. From the ceiling. Into the wall. The same wall beside his bed. The same place where the indentations had appeared. The surface trembled slightly. Not violently. Just enough to confirm what he already knew. It had returned. And it had found a new way to reach him. The knocking resumed. Closer now. More precise. He backed away until he reached the door. His breathing had grown shallow again, his eyes locked on the spot where the movement was most visible. The wall shifted again. The indentations deepened. The shape beneath the surface became clearer. Long. Thin. Pressing outward. A hand. Not fully formed. Not fully visible. But unmistakable. It pressed against the inside of the wall, the outline of fingers stretching the paint outward as if testing its limits. He turned and pulled the door open, stepping into the hallway without hesitation. The corridor outside felt brighter, more stable, but the sense of unease followed him. He didn't stop walking until he reached the elevator. He pressed the button repeatedly, glancing back toward his apartment door. For a moment, everything remained still. Then the sound reached him. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Knocking. Not from inside his apartment. From inside the walls of the hallway. The sound moved slowly along the corridor, traveling through the structure itself. Approaching. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the walls around him. The knocking continued. Closer. Closer. The elevator doors opened behind him. He stepped inside quickly and turned around. The hallway remained empty. Silent. But just before the doors closed, he saw it. A slight distortion in the wall near his apartment door. The surface shifted inward for a fraction of a second. As if something had pressed against it from the other side. Watching him leave. The elevator descended. The movement felt too slow. Too exposed. Every second stretched longer than it should have. When he finally reached the ground floor, he stepped out quickly and moved toward the building exit without looking back. The night air outside felt colder than usual. Sharper. Real. But even there, standing on the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Not physically. Not visibly. But through something else. Through the structure. Through the spaces people never think about. He looked up at the building. Hundreds of windows stared back at him. Dark. Silent. Except for one. His bedroom. A faint shadow moved behind the curtains. Not large. Not fast. Just enough to confirm what he already feared. Whatever had been inside the walls was no longer limited to them. It had learned the layout. It had learned his movements. And now it knew exactly where he would go next. Because walls were never barriers. They were pathways. And in a building that tall, there were more pathways than anyone could ever see. Walls are supposed to protect you. Separate you from everything outside. But in places where people live stacked above and beside each other, walls are never truly solid. They hide spaces. They carry sound. And sometimes they carry something else. So if you ever hear knocking from inside your walls, don't answer it. Because it might already know where you are. Subscribe for more stories you weren't meant to hear.